To EmilyBronte, Wuthering Heights, Original Edition, Chapter 2. Yesterday afternoon set in, misty and cold. I had half a mind to spend it by my study fire, instead of wading through heath and mud to Wuthering Heights. On coming up from dinner, however, I dined between 12 and 1 o'clock. The housekeeper, a matronly lady, taken as a fixture along with the house, could not, or would not. Knocked vainly for admittance, till my knuckles tingled and the dogs howled. Wretched inmates, I ejaculated mentally, you deserve perpetual isolation from your species for your churlish inhospitality. At least, I would not keep my doors barred in the daytime. I don't care, I will get in. So resolved, I grasped the latch and shook it vehemently. Vinegar-faced Joseph projected his head from a round window of the barn. What are ye for? He shouted. T meesters, Dan, T fouled. Go rand byth and ut lath. If ya went ta spake told him, is there nobody inside to open the door? I hallooed, responsively. They's nobbit, T missus, and shul nut opent and ye mac wire flaysome dins till neat. Why, cannot you tell her who I am, Joseph? Nor ni me, all hi know a hend wit, muttered the head, vanishing. The snow began to drive thickly. I seized the handle to essay another trial, when a young man, without coat, and shouldering a pitchfork, appeared in the yard behind. He hailed me to follow him, and after marching through a washhouse, an individual whose existence I had never previously suspected, I bowed and waited, thinking she would bid me take a seat. She looked at me, leaning back in her chair, and remained motionless and mute. Rough weather. I remarked, I'm afraid, Mrs. Heathcliff, the door must bear the consequence of your servant's leisure attendance. I had hard work to make them hear me. She never opened her mouth. I stared, she stared also. At any rate, she kept her eyes on me in a cool, regardless manner, exceedingly embarrassing and disagreeable. Sit down, said the young man gruffly. He'll be in soon. I obeyed, and hemmed, and called the villain Juno, who deigned, at the second interview, to move the extreme tip of her tail, in token of owning my acquaintance. A beautiful animal. I commenced again. Do you intend parting with the little ones, madam? They are not mine, said the amiable hostess, more repellingly than Heathcliff himself could have replied. Ah, your favorites are among these? I continued, turning to an obscure cushion full of something like cats. A strange choice of favorites, she observed scornful. Unluckily, was a heap of dead rabbits. I hemmed once more, and drew closer to the hearth, repeating my comment on the wildness of the evening. You should not have come out, she said, rising and reaching from the chimney-piece two of the painted canisters. Her position before was sheltered from the light. Now, I had a distinct view of her whole figure and countenance. She was slender, and apparently scarcely past girlhood, an admirable form, and the most exquisite little face that I have ever had the pleasure of beholding. Small features, very fair, flaxen ringlets, or rather golden, hanging loose on her delicate neck. She turned upon me as a miser might turn if anyone attempted to assist him in counting his gold. I don't want your help, she snapped. I can get them for myself. I beg your pardon, I hastened to reply. Were you asked to tea? She demanded, tying an apron over her neat black frock, and standing with a spoonful of the leaf poised over the pot. I shall be glad to have a cup, I answered. Were you asked? She repeated. No, said, half smiling. You are the proper person to ask me. I began to doubt whether he were a servant or not. His dress and speech were both rude, entirely devoid of the superiority observable in Mr. and Mrs. Heathcliff. His thick brown curls were rough and uncultivated, his whiskers encroached bearishly over his cheeks, and his hands were embrowned like those of a common laborer. Still his bearing was free, almost haughty. You see, sir, I am come, according to promise, I exclaimed, assuming the cheerful, and I fear I shall be weather-bound for half an hour, if you can afford me shelter during that space. Half an hour, he said, shaking the white flakes from his clothes. I wonder you should select the thick of a snowstorm to ramble about in. Do you know that you run a risk of being lost in the marshes? People familiar with these moors often miss their road on such evenings, and I can tell you there is no chance of a change at present. Perhaps I can get a guide among your lads, and he might stay at the Grange till morning. Could you spare me one? No, I could not. Oh, indeed. Well, then, must trust to my own sagacity. Umph. Are you going to Macth? Demanded he of the shabby coat, shifting his ferocious gaze from me to the young lady. Is he to have any? She asked, appealing to Heathcliff. Get it ready, will you? Was the answer, uttered so savagely that I started. The tone in which the words were said revealed a genuine bad nature. I no longer felt inclined to call Heathcliff a capital fellow. And it was impossible, however ill-tempered they might be, that the universal scowl they wore was their everyday countenance. My amiable lady, he interrupted, with an almost diabolical sneer on his face. Where is she, my amiable lady? Mrs. Heathcliff, your wife, I mean. Well, yes-o, you would intimate that her spirit has taken the post of ministering angel, and guards the fortunes of Wuthering Heights, even when her body is gone. Is that it? Perceiving myself in a blunder, I attempted to correct it. I might have seen there was too great a disparity between the ages of the parties to make it likely that they were man and wife. One was about 40, a period of mental vigor at which men seldom cherish the delusion of being married for love by girls. That dream is reserved for the solace of our declining years. The other did not look 17. The last reflection may seem conceited. It was not. My neighbor struck me as bordering on repulsive. I knew, through experience, that I was tolerably attractive. Muttered on my behalf, which, however, I took care not to notice. And happy in your conjectures, sir, observed my host. We neither of us have the privilege of owning your good fairy. Her mate is dead. I said she was my daughter-in-law, therefore, she must have married my son. And this young man is not my son, assuredly. Heathcliff smiled again, as if it were rather too bold a jest to attribute the paternity of that bear to him. My name is Hareton Earnshaw, growled the other, and I'd counsel you to respect it. I've shown no disrespect, was my reply, laughing internally at the dignity with which he announced himself. He fixed his eye on me longer than I cared to return the stare, for fear I might be tempted either to box his ears or render my hilarity audible. I began to feel unmistakably out of place in that pleasant family circle. The dismal spiritual atmosphere overcame, and more than neutralized, the glowing physical comforts round me, and I resolved to be cautious. How I ventured under those rafters a third time. I don't think it possible for me to get home now without a guide, I could not help exclaiming. The roads will be buried already. And if they were bare, I could scarcely distinguish a foot in advance. Hareton, drive those dozen sheep into the barn porch. They'll be covered if left in the fold all night, and put a plank before them, said Heathcliff. How must I do? I continued, with rising irritation. There was no reply to my question, and on looking round, I saw only Joseph bringing in a pail of porridge for the dogs, and Mrs. Heathcliff leaning over the fire. I imagined for a moment that this piece of eloquence was addressed to me, and sufficiently enraged, stepped towards the aged rascal, with an intention of kicking him out of the door. Mrs. Heathcliff, however, checked me by her answer. The red cow didn't die by chance, and your rheumatism can hardly be reckoned among providential visitations. Oh, wicked, wicked, gasped the elder. May the Lord deliver us from evil? No, reprobate, you are a castaway, be off, or I'll hurt you seriously. I'll have you all modeled in wax and clay, and the first who passes the limits I fix, I'll not say what he shall be done to, but you'll see. Go, I'm looking at you. The little witch put a mock malignity into her beautiful eyes, and Joseph, trembling with sincere horror, hurried out, praying and ejaculating wicked as he went. Then, if you hear of me being discovered dead in a bog or a pit full of snow, your conscience won't whisper that it is partly your fault? How so? I cannot escort you. They wouldn't let me go to the end of the garden wall. I should be sorry to ask you to cross the threshold, for my convenience, on such a night, I cried. I want you to tell me my way to show it. Or else to persuade Mr. Heathcliff to give me a guide. Who? There is himself, Earnshaw, Zillah, Joseph, and I. Which would you have? Are there no boys at the farm? No, those are all. Then, it follows that I am compelled to stay. That you may settle with your host. I have nothing to do with it. I hope it will be a lesson to you to make no more rash journeys on these hills, cried Heathcliff's stern voice from the kitchen entrance. As to staying here, I don't keep accommodations for visitors. You must share a bed with Hareton or Joseph, if you do. I can sleep on a chair in this room, I replied. No, no, a stranger is a stranger, be he rich or poor. It will not suit me to permit anyone the range of the place while I am off guard, said the unmannerly wretch. At first, the young man appeared about to befriend me. I'll go with him as far as the park, he said. You'll go with him to hell, exclaimed his master, or whatever relation he bore. And who is to look after the horses, eh? A man's life is of more consequence than one evening's neglect of the horses. Somebody must go, murmured Mrs. Heathcliff more kindly than I expected. Not at your command, retorted Hareton. If you set store on him, you'd better be quiet. Then I hope his ghost will haunt you, and I hope Mr. Heathcliff will never get another tenant till the Grange is a ruin, she answered sharply. Hearken, hearken, shoes cursing on 'em, muttered Joseph, towards whom I had been steering. On opening the little door, two hairy monsters flew at my throat, bearing me down and extinguishing the light, while a mingled guffaw from Heathcliff and Hareton put the copestone on my rage and humiliation. With several incoherent threats of retaliation that, in their indefinite depth of virulency, smacked of King Lear. The vehemence of my agitation brought on a copious bleeding at the nose, and still Heathcliff laughed, and still I scolded. I don't know what would have concluded the scene, had there not been one person at hand rather more rational than myself, and more benevolent than my entertainer. This was Zillah, the stout housewife, who at length issued forth to inquire into the nature of the uproar. She thought that some of them had been laying violent hands on me, and, not daring to attack her master, she turned her vocal artillery against the young scoundrel. Well, Mr. Earnshaw, she cried, I wonder what you'll have agate next. Are we going to murder folk on our very doorstones? I see this house will never do for me. Look at t poor lad, he's fair choking. Wisht, you must go on so. Come in, and I'll cure that. There now, hold ye still. With these words, she suddenly splashed a pint of icy water down my neck, and pulled me into the kitchen. Mr. Heathcliff followed, his accidental merriment expiring quickly in his habitual moroseness. I was sick exceedingly, and dizzy, and faint, and thus compelled perforce to accept lodgings under his roof. He told Zillah to give me a glass of brandy, and then passed on to the inner room, while she condoled with me on my sorry predicament, and having obeyed his orders, whereby I was somewhat revived, ushered me to bed.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.